Hello, everyone. I'm Amber Kaiser. I'm part of the Dog Aging Project Communications team, and I'm so pleased to be with you today for this really interesting conversation that we're going to have. I want to thank Eric for putting together that fun slideshow of dog participants in the Dog Aging Project. I always love going on the dog park forum and having a look at the cute dog pics thread whenever I'm having a rough day. It's the best. So for those of you who are watching here on YouTube Live, the best way for you to be able to ask questions or enter our prize giveaway is to follow the link that's below this video. It will take you to the thread in the dog park where you can post questions or comments. Any entry there will be an entry into our giveaway. You can also post questions in the YouTube chat, and we will try to get to those if we can. This video will also be available afterwards to watch as a recording, and so you're welcome to share the link with family and friends. Or if you can't stay for the whole event today, you can always come back to our YouTube channel and find this. So thanks for being with us today. Today's discussion is about the practice of shelter medicine with Dr. Dev Anand and Dr. Creevy. Then we're going to have a Q&A. And we'll get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. If we don't get to them all, we usually try to answer the rest of them on the Dog Park Forum thread throughout the next week. We'll have a few project updates after that, and then we're going to conclude the event today with an introduction to a very special rescue dog who's part of the Dog Aging Project. So thank you all for joining us, and now I'd like to introduce you to our guests. So if you two can turn on your cameras, that would be great. Thank you. I'm so glad you're here with us today. So introductions. Dr. Dev Anand is the Chief Veterinary and Medical Director of the Houston SPCA, which I think is the oldest and largest animal protection agency in Texas. Is that right?
That's correct.
And her background includes companion animal private practice, animal protection, and sheltering. She is an instructor and has spent a significant portion of her career in academia. So there are some very lucky students of vet technology and veterinary medicine who've been able to learn about shelter medicine from Dr. Dev. So welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
At the Dog Aging Project, Dr. Dev is a member of our Animal Welfare Advisory Board. And so we're so pleased that you're part of our team in that capacity.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Dr. Creevy is our Chief Veterinary Officer at the Dog Aging Project. So most of you have probably seen her face before. She's also an associate professor of small animal internal medicine at Texas A&M University's College of Veterinary Medicine and a practicing small animal internist. She's been working on longitudinal studies of aging, healthy aging in companion dogs since 2007. So thank you so much for making time out of your day to be with us today.
Absolutely. Delighted to be here.
So hopefully this will just be mostly a pretty casual conversation. But maybe a good place to start would be with you, Dr. Dev. Can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to focus on shelter medicine in your career?
Absolutely. You know, when I graduated from the University of Missouri, way back in 2004, I don't think that I had shelter medicine as my end goal in my career. What I realized very quickly when I started practicing in a general practice, small animal medicine, was that I really developed a love for surgery. I had a passion for it. I had a passion for spaying and neutering and preventing a pet overpopulation. And because of that, that drew me into the shelter medicine world. And so after about 3 years in general practice, I applied for a position at the Houston SPCA for a staff veterinary position. And it was really the draw of spay, neuter, and preventing pet overpopulation that drew me to the world of shelter medicine. And I've just had a passion for it ever since. I really enjoy it.
That's great. Thank you. I don't know if very many people are familiar with sort of how shelter medicine as a specialty. I wonder if you might be able to talk about that a little bit.
Yes, it's a relatively new specialty where students and veterinarians who want to become board certified in animal sheltering and in shelter medicine can become board certified in that area. previously, it really wasn't a board specialty, and there wasn't a lot of professional training in shelter medicine. When we think about the history of shelters and the history of shelter medicine, most people might still think about shelters, in that old mentality from decades ago, where when we look at animal shelters, we're thinking of it almost as like a pound. You think about animals going into this building, these poor, lost, injured, sick animals going into a pound, and maybe the medical care that they get is not top notch, and so that has been historically the mentality about animal sheltering and animal shelters. But over the last 20 years or so, we've realized that we can really do a lot for the animals in the community, the lost, the abused, the abandoned animals in the community, and that shelter medicine really has an important part, not only in helping those individual animals, but how that translates into keeping the community healthy, including people. And so over the last 20 years or so, we've seen shelter medicine really change and shift and become such a wonderful field to go into. There's master's programs available, there are graduate degrees, there's board certification. And so now anyone who has an interest in that population of animals, that lost, abused, abandoned population, can really study how we can do a better job for the community of animals. So it's really become a great field, and I'm happy to educate everyone about it.
Dr. Creevy, in your role teaching veterinary students, are you seeing more, what are you seeing with respect to interest in moving into shelter medicine? And maybe the two of you could talk a little bit about sort of the interface between general practice and shelter medicine too.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Dr. Dev said, and I do think that I increasingly see students developing a better understanding of the role of shelters in the community, and with that, an increased interest in learning about shelters or positioning themselves to be able to help shelters. In addition to pursuing specialty board certification or advanced degrees in shelters, there are many communities where there's a relatively small shelter, particularly rural communities. And in a state like Texas, we have a lot of rural communities, and they don't actually need a very large facility, and they don't actually need a very complex program, but they do need a veterinarian to be available to assist them. And these programs might be run by non-veterinarians, and then they have access to a veterinarian in the community. And I have a lot of students who ask about that. How can they, if they're going to be in general practice, how can they position themselves to be available to their community's shelter? And I think that's as Dr. Dev was mentioning, I think that's a big transition that has happened with sheltering as compared to thinking of, as you said, sort of the pound where unwanted animals go. I think the shelters are now becoming a community resource for not where unwanted animals go, but where people who want animals go to get one, right? And to learn about how to care for them, and to understand preventive health, and to understand appropriate husbandry of different species, and in that way more integrated into building pets into families in communities. And I think that's a great transition.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that, the community resource, because one of the wonderful parts about shelter medicine and animal sheltering is being able to, one, reunite lost animals with their owners. So the shelter has become that kind of temporary home for animals where, if they're lost, that they can get really good medical care until we can reunite them with their owner. And that would be the most ideal situation for the animals that come through. But even if they don't, as you mentioned, helping these animals find a more permanent home, that not only benefits that animal, but it also benefits the person who's adopting the animal. We know all of the health benefits of owning a pet. And so we understand how that can help with, decreased depression. Everyone in this forum understands that, but that's a very important aspect. And then taking animals off the street really helps to stabilize the community too, right? Just performing spays and neuters and making sure that the population of animals in the community doesn't become more than what the infrastructure can handle. Shelters play a huge role in that, in public health and keeping that animal population stabilized. So it's a huge community resource. Education is important. Programs where we can teach people how to properly care for their pet, where we can educate the young. We love to do that in the shelter, to have young students come tour the shelter, understand what it's like to learn about animal care. And in that way, we can hopefully help them be better pet owners as they grow up and understand how important it is to make sure their pets are in good health all the time. So.
Yeah, Amber, going back to your question about how shelter practice and general practice differ, I tend to think of general practice as the family doctor who has a long-term relationship with the pet and the family and helps that pet and family achieve a successful long-term healthy life from being a puppy or a kitten to being, an active adult to being a senior pet. And where I think the shelter plays a role is in launching that process, right? Connecting a family to the right pet, to a type of pet that suits their home life and the composition of the home and the type of exercise or access to the outdoors that the animal would have, or the nature of, how energetic a pet is appropriate for this family, and getting them off to an excellent start by making those connections and those matches that are successful. And then hopefully providing ongoing education to the community and not much else. But in a moment of need, if a pet were to escape or get lost, the shelter is there as a safety net a second time for that animal. And so I think I tend to think of them having those complementary roles in the ownership of pets.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you want to talk a little bit, Dr. Creevy, about why you think it's important to include rescue dogs in the dog aging project?
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely essential that we have rescue dogs in the dog aging project. The dog aging project wants to study healthy longevity in all kinds of dogs. And in order to study all kinds of dogs, we not only need all types and breeds and sizes of dogs, but we need dogs who started their lives in all sorts of ways. We need dogs whose lives started in the cities and on the farms, and we need dogs whose lives began in earnest when they met their family at the shelter and went home with that family. And so the early life experiences of dogs from shelters might be different from the early life experiences of dogs who were not acquired from shelters. And then also many people acquire dogs from shelters at older ages, particularly because it is valuable to know how big the dog's going to get and what its temperament is, right? Acquiring a puppy is so fun. Puppies are so fun. They're also a little bit unpredictable, right? They're going to grow up and they're going to get as big as they're going to get, and they're going to be as rowdy as they're going to be. And you can't know that stuff very effectively when they're puppies. Whereas adopting an adult dog gives the adoptive family the opportunity to say, okay, we know what this dog is like. We know how this dog behaves. We know how big this dog's going to be. And so I think there are all sorts of folks for whom adopting a puppy doesn't make a ton of sense, but adopting an adult dog does. And we want to include those people as well as those dogs in our dog aging project family, because we want to understand all of those different kinds of origin stories.
Are there data gaps that concern you, or how does the project deal with the fact that there may be portions of a dog's life that are unknown?
Sure. So absolutely, if we acquire dogs as adults and we don't know where they came from and we don't know anything about their puppy experiences, that's absolutely true that the kinds of questions we might ask in the dog aging project about the animal's history or the health before the present day, the owner might not know that. But that's actually okay. The design of our study is two things. It's what we call cross-sectional, which means we take all the dogs we have right now and compare them to one another. And for that purpose, I don't need to know anything about your dog other than what you know right now. Our study is also longitudinal, meaning that from the moment you enroll your dog in the dog aging project, we're going to follow you out for the rest of your dog's life. And for dogs who are acquired at the age of 3 or 4, yeah, we don't know what happened to them before that, but from the moment they sign up, we can know what happens to them every step of the way for the rest of the time that they're a member of the project. And so we can actually manage those data gaps through the way we analyze the data, and it's not a problem. So we absolutely welcome and encourage dogs who are acquired as adults, dogs who are acquired from shelters to join our project.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's a question we tend to get a lot at the dog aging project. As I mentioned when I was introducing both of you, Dr. Dev, you're part of our animal welfare board, and I was hoping that we could spend just a little bit of time before we transition into the Q&A to talk about the animal care oversight for the dog aging project, sort of in general, Dr. Creevy. And then maybe Dr. Dev, you could talk a little bit about the mission of the Animal Welfare Advisory Board and your role on that.
Sure. So it's important to understand that whenever research is done in this country, a number of oversight bodies make sure that that research is safe and appropriate. And that's true whether the research is being done with people or is being done with animals. And in our case, our research participants are dogs. The dogs bring their human family members with them, but primarily we're studying the dogs. And so our research participants are dogs. That means that in order to do this research project, we had to get permission from the animal, the IACUC basically, which is the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. So the IACUC is a term you might have heard. And this is a group of people who reviews our proposed research and tells us if it's suitable. So they say that this is, first of all, going to work, that you're going to be able to learn what you propose to learn. We don't want to do wasteful research. And second of all, that we are appropriately caring for the animals in our study, in our case, the dogs. So they ask questions about what are you doing with the dogs? For instance, if you're collecting blood from the dogs, well, who's going to collect the blood and what's that person's training? If you're doing other kinds of research that you might have heard of in people or in pets where surgeries are done or medications are administered, they ask for the background data on what is that surgery and how are you doing it and who is doing it, or what is that medication and why are you studying it and what are the possible side effects? And so an external group reviews everything about our planned research before we're permitted to do it. Because our research is with owned dogs, we also want the human owner to feel informed and involved. And so there's a second group that is called the Clinical Research and Review Committee, and they take care of the dog owner. So we have informed consent documents that fully explain our study. And that group is the ones that make sure we've explained it well, that what we've explained is the same as what we've proposed to do in the research, that we've described it in such a way that the average person could understand it. And that group also stands ready to assist anybody who wants to contact them and ask questions about our study. So those organizations are always in place when veterinarians or other people do research with owned pets, dogs, cats, horses, whatever it is. Those two bodies will be involved in making sure the research is safe and appropriate and that the owners are fully informed so that they can choose to participate or not as best suits their family. And in addition to that, we at the Dog Aging Project chose to create an animal welfare advisory board. So this is an independent body that we were not obligated to create, but we wanted to make sure that we had the most transparent possible way for people who are involved with the Dog Aging Project or hear about the Dog Aging Project to understand our commitment to welfare and the safety of the enrolled dogs, and also to reach out and contact us and ask questions if they have them, knowing that they're speaking to people who are independent of the research, people who are going to be absolutely honest with them. And so we intentionally created the Animal Welfare Advisory Board to meet this additional ethical responsibility that we feel we have to take best care of the dogs and people in our study. And we're delighted that Dr. Dev is a member of that board.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to be a part of the Animal Welfare Advisory Board. And as Dr. Creevy mentioned, we're an independent group that really is there to be a safe space for anyone to bring potential concerns forward. And that can be from researchers, it can be from project participants, from the general public, really anyone who feels like they have a concern about the animal welfare. And that could be a physical concern that they have for their pet that's enrolled in the project. It could be emotional, anything that they feel like could be an animal welfare concern, they're welcome to bring forward. And our board will review it. And we can advise the executive leadership team about that particular concern and make suggestions or changes if necessary. Or sometimes it may be that we're just able to ease the concerns of that person and explain things so that the concern can be addressed. So we're happy to be here and happy to be here to provide that safe space for anyone who feels like they need that.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'll just let everybody out there know that if you want to contact our Animal Welfare Board, you can do that through our normal email channels and they will get sent to the right spot. Before we shift into the Q&A, I was just curious for you two to talk a little bit about how you envision that the research coming out of the Dog Aging Project might inform or influence the practice of shelter medicine. So sort of how you two see that, what are your hopes for the future in that way?
That's a great question. I'm actually very interested to hear what Dr. Dev has to say about this. Some things that I hope that the Dog Aging Project can provide to shelters is, I mentioned earlier about how hard people in shelters work to ensure that they create a good match, that they find a family who's a good fit for a particular dog who needs a home. And frequently we're working with pretty limited information about those dogs. If they came into the shelter from an unknown background or haven't been at the shelter for very long, shelter staff are using their best judgment, and they generally have great deals of experience in this topic, but we don't have very specific ways to predict, for instance, adult dog behaviors or adult dog size, even in some cases, if it's a mixed breed puppy. And so we hope that some of the things that we'll learn through the genetic analysis of the Dog Aging Project might enable us to give shelters a tool to better predict what a puppy that appears in the shelter is going to be like as an adult dog. So hopefully to make a better match with the right kind of family. And then the other thing that I'm very interested in is how early life exposures and diseases impact later life health. So we have a lot of interest in how parasites or viruses that young dogs in particular are susceptible to might influence their health down the road. And I hope that understanding better what those relationships are might enable us to improve the way we manage early life preventive health for puppies, not just puppies in shelters, but puppies everywhere, although shelters do quite a lot of early life health care for puppies.
Yes, that all sounds wonderful. And I completely agree with the matching part of it, because again, our goal is to get animals into permanent homes. And a lot of that starts at the beginning. Making sure that we find the right match for them and educating owners about potential needs that pet might need later, or care that the pet might need later, what to expect, and how to, again, help the pet live the longest life so that they can have that life together as a family. So I'm excited to see what we can do with the data as well, because everything from genetics, it's always fun in the shelter to see what breed of dog is this, and when we're considering the breed of dog of this, how do we use that information to educate owners about the health care of the pet? But as you guys know, the animals in the shelter are very difficult to kind of pin down to a particular breed, and to try to give that information to adopters. So information that might come out of this project could help us better guide adopters, I think, for the future of their pet.
Thank you for that. That's actually a great segue into one of our first questions. So if you're ready, I'll dive into Q&A from our viewers. So Judith writes, she is involved in rescuing and fostering dogs and litters of puppies that are born to street dogs in Mexico. And she is wondering, what are some of the most important health items to check when rescuing a puppy of unknown origin?
Oh, absolutely. I think just starting with, it depends on who's doing the initial evaluation of the pet, but we can learn a lot just from using our 5 senses, right? Just from looking at the body condition of the pet, whether they're an appropriate body weight for the age, looking at respiratory rate, heart rate, do they have external parasites like fleas and ticks? And then can we go further to test them for things like internal parasites? Do they have, intestinal parasites? Do they have heartworm disease? Those things can really be determined in a 10 or 15-minute exam. And so veterinarians or veterinary technicians, or even those who are very well educated in the field of veterinary medicine, can do an initial cursory exam to try to determine the health of the animal. Even basic things like lifting the upper lip and looking at the gum color of the animal to determine whether the gum color is more toward pale white or more toward pink. Those things can tell us a lot. So we can learn a lot just from that general exam. And so I would say, if we're dealing with puppies of unknown origin, we want to make sure that we're ruling out infectious and contagious diseases. So things like parasites, parvoviruses, and just kind of overall health is what I would say that they can focus on.
That's great. She had a little bit of a follow-up to that question about whether her own personal dog, who likes to interact with these puppies as sort of their foster dog mom, whether there are health concerns that might endanger her when she's interacting with these rescues. I feel like you've sort of touched on that.
I would definitely recommend that her personal pet be fully vaccinated on flea prevention, heartworm prevention, tick prevention, and then usually adult dogs, have a lower incidence of contracting some of those more serious diseases. And I think as long as she is keeping her personal pet, her adult dog, well vaccinated and on preventive care, then the chances that her pet is going to contract something from the puppies is low. And so that's where I would start.
Great. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Max was wondering about how eyes and hearing are checked in shelter dogs.
Oh, yes. So it depends on the shelter, but shelters see a lot of animals coming through each day. And so when we're doing a general physical exam, usually we're looking for things that might prompt us to do further testing. So one of the things he may be wondering is how deeply do we test those things? How deeply do we test eyesight and hearing? And maybe unless, in a lot of situations, unless there's something that triggers us to look further into it, that initial exam may be, looking at the eyes. Do they look symmetrical? Do the eyes respond to light appropriately? Does it seem like the animal is aware of his or her surroundings? Are they appropriately following people around the room? Does the animal seem to be, in terms of hearing, startled? Do we, can we walk up on the animal while it's in the run, and are we startling the animal? That might trigger us to say, I wonder if this animal has a hearing problem. So those things, unless we notice something to allow us to look further into those things, we may not be able to do very deep checks. For example, we're not checking every animal for glaucoma. We're not necessarily testing every animal for hearing loss. It would be something that we pick up on our physical exam that makes us say, I'm not sure that this animal is following me appropriately around the room. He or she may have a vision problem. Let's look further into that. Or as I mentioned before, the animal that doesn't seem to be aware of you or pay attention to you when loud noises are happening. Those things might trigger us to say this animal may have a problem. So that's generally how it goes, a general basic physical exam at first.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking back to that question we were discussing, sort of differences between general practice and shelter practice. And it strikes me that in a general practice, often that practitioner knows the dog's coming in with a family that knows that dog too. But what you're talking about is sort of like getting to know a dog and really trying to understand what that dog's got going on. And that seems like would be a really exciting part of practicing shelter medicine.
Yes, that's a good point, because there's a couple things that you point out there. One, the sheer volume of animals that tend to come through shelters change a little bit about the way that we do our physical exams. We do a lot of overall examination, and then we look for little clues to help us to go further. And sometimes in general practice, we are able to, just because of the nature of the situation, do a little bit more thorough, in-depth exam, in a short period of time. In general practice, I remember being in general practice and easily spending, 20 or 30 minutes doing a very thorough exam on an animal. But in that day, I may be seeing 10 or 15 animals. In a shelter, which is something we hope to change one day, in shelters, sometimes we're seeing 30, 40, 50 animals a day, and time just does not allow those very in-depth examinations that you might get if you were taking your pet to a general practice. So something to consider for sure.
But it sounds like you have to be really good at like being a detective, right? And quickly assessing where there are areas you might want to go deeper.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Picking up on those clues really quickly in a short answer, yes.
So shifting gears just a little bit, there have been some questions, I think, both about the history and philosophy of sheltering in the US. And so maybe the first question from someone on our forum called Wondrous Pugs, which is an awesome forum handle. They would like to hear a little bit more about the history of sheltering in the US and where private rescue organizations fit in to public shelters.
Sure. I mean, I believe shelters in the US started, maybe in the late 1800s and were originally established to be places where lost livestock could go to be reclaimed and cared for. So it was predominantly a large animal protection agency where livestock who were roaming the streets could be temporarily confined so that their owners could come get them. Livestock were very valuable. And animal sheltering as it related to dogs and cats was lower down on the list. And then as we moved more toward, dogs and cats being pets and family members, and then those municipal shelters started to, and as the livestock became reclaimed, then some of these municipal shelters began to focus more on dogs and cats and finding them more permanent homes and getting them off the streets. But it definitely was more of a large animal protection agency. I know there were some shelters that were even involved in protecting families, women and children. There were some just protection agencies that even kind of incorporated that into their mission as well. And then, as time went on, it moved more toward dogs and cats. So, and as a private shelter, as 501c3 organizations, the mission is still the same. The difference is just, again, what services we can offer based on fundraising, based on development, and maybe not getting so much funding from the government. Some of these private organizations can tailor their services based on their individual mission. So they can set their individual mission and tailor their services based on that.
Thank you.
I think that that's a really interesting thing that's happening in shelters is that, there's not just a one size fits all shelter. The needs of Houston for a shelter might be quite different from the needs of a very small town in a northern part of the country, the types of animals and the types of illnesses and the types of problems that are seen. And I think that the notion of, sort of city or county or municipal or state level funding for some shelters, and then in other areas, perhaps where that funding isn't available, individuals who have a concern for the community and identify a need in that community can start working towards having a shelter plan in place that specifically addresses the needs of their local community. And I think it's terrific that we're moving to a more community-centric and community-focused development design of different kinds of shelters.
Well, and also that there's that community, going back to that shelter as a community resource conversation we were having earlier. Like I know there's on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation near where I live, there is a woman who is kind of the foster person for the reservation, and she's part of that community. She has trust with that community, and she helps connect people with services for their pets, and because she knows what that community needs.
Right, she's meeting a need for the human and animal members of the community. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So David had a question about sort of myths and misconceptions around shelters and shelter medicines. One of those that he highlights being that that animals go in and there's a race to get them adopted, and if they don't get adopted, then their lives are ended. And he just sort of wanted you to talk a little bit on that misconception about shelters.
Absolutely. Our goal is to certainly find permanent adoptive homes for these animals. And it's a very interesting question and discussion topic, because I do think that there may be this misconception that there's unlimited time and resources. And one thing I would like to highlight is that shelters do have some limitations, essentially, some limited resources. And so when animals come into shelters, the goal is really to find them homes. we really do not want animals to spend extended periods of times in shelters if we can help it. We really want them to be able to live their lives as normally as possible as a normal dog or cat, or in our case, guinea pig or rat or rodent, whatever it is that's coming in. And so because in certain areas, there's what we would call pet overpopulation. That's not true around the entire United States, but certainly in some pockets of the United States, there is more homeless animals than there are homes for them. And so you have these pockets, and it's a real thing. We have these pockets where we have large numbers of animals looking for homes. And the longer that they stay in the shelter, then we do get concerned about their welfare in the shelter. Are they getting the enrichment that they need? Are they going to find that permanent home? And so we do want to encourage people to adopt animals from shelters, but I wouldn't say that there's such a rush that if no one adopts this animal in a given particular period of time, that it may result in euthanasia. I don't think that that happens, but I don't think that that is the rule, right? Those may be the exceptions. Most shelters will, especially these days, most shelters will go to any length to find the right home for that particular animal. That may be using social media. That may be saying, you know what, if this animal is not finding the proper home in our facility, maybe this animal needs exposure in another area of the country. Maybe that means that this animal can take a road trip a few hours north to another state and get more exposure there. Maybe there's a family there. And so what we're seeing in shelters is that in these areas where there may be more animal homelessness than there are homes available for them, how can we work to get these animals to places that have the available homes? How can we work to get those animals there? And so I think shelters do a wonderful job at doing that. I don't want to pretend as if there's no euthanasia that happens, but most of that is related to health or behavior issues and works toward keeping the broader community safe. And it is less so what people have that myth of, less so as this animal has 3 days and that's it. It's not that anymore. Most euthanasias in shelters tends to be medical related or behavior related. And in those cases, may be better for the broader community, as opposed to, you certainly can think about putting very aggressive animals out into homes or very sick or injured animals. And so I would say that now that's a myth. Maybe that used to be true many decades ago, but the work that we're able to do to find almost any animal a home is really amazing. There's always that home out there that's willing to take an animal in. So just takes a little bit more networking and getting that animal to the right area.
And maybe
the other thing I would, go ahead, Amber.
No, you go ahead.
The other thing I would add to that, and Dr. Dev, maybe you can talk about this a little bit from the HSPCA's experience, but again, thinking of shelters as a community resource, they provide a good to the community, but the shelter needs to lean on the community. And one of the things that's true of shelters is that the building is only as big as it is, right? So we get to places in shelters where we have more animals than we have kennel space. And a lot of shelters lean on the community for fostering. So some of our people who've written in with questions have mentioned that they do fostering. That is a way that a shelter can expand its capacity beyond what the physical building can allow. And these animals can be fostered out in the community until a home is available, or until, as you mentioned, Dr. Dev, the animal can be sent to a community that has more homes in need of pets than the community that has more pets in need of homes. So is that something that you do at HSPCA, work with fosters in the community?
That's exactly what we need. But you said it wonderfully, because it's not just what the decisions that we make in the shelter. Really, when we talk about shelters being a community, saving animal lives is really a community effort. It's not just those of us who are working in the shelters. We need those on the outside to help us save these animal lives. As you mentioned, the building, the brick and mortar shelter can only house so many animals. There's only so many staff members that can take care of the animals. There's only so much resources. And so the bigger the community can be to help the local animal shelters, the more lives that are going to be saved. And absolutely what that looks like for the community is fostering. having the community determine for your family, those of you who are out there who are interested in foster, what sort of animal do you think you would be able to take into your home temporarily? Does that mean one little kitten? Does it mean one dog that just needs a couple of months for its hair to regrow because maybe it had mange and it was out on the street, and so it's this poor bald looking dog that really is in great health but just needs some time for it to get a full coat of hair and then go on to a new home? What does that look like for each individual family in terms of saving animal lives? And the more that we can include the community in fostering and volunteering. When I mentioned animals staying in the shelter for extended periods of time, volunteers are amazing at coming in to walk dogs, to play with cats, to give them that socialization, that human interaction that they need to make their quality of life really good while they wait for their permanent home. And so, yes, fosters and volunteers are critical to the success of saving more lives and helping the quality of the animal's life be better until they find that forever home. So the Houston SPCA has a really wonderful foster program and an extensive volunteer program. And we're always looking for community members to join us, always. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without the fosters and without the volunteers who come every single day to give their time to these animals. And we appreciate it a lot.
I'm so glad we ended up talking about this, because this is something that each and every one of us could get involved with in our own communities, right?
Absolutely.
So there are these incredible shelter veterinarians like Dr. Dev who are making sure that these animals are healthy and happy, and then volunteers who aren't veterinarians like me could come in and help. I love that. It's awesome.
And honestly, I mean, even for some families, it's not appropriate to take in another pet, but I really want to highlight what Dr. Dev said about going to the shelter and walking the dogs, socializing the cats, making them really attractive pets for someone to adopt, because they know how to interact around people, and they know how to walk on a leash, and they know how to play, and they make eye contact, and they want to be picked up and held. So I think folks who are looking for a way to become involved, and it's just not appropriate to add another pet to your home for whatever reason, there still is a lot you can do.
Absolutely.
Well, and I've also read some great articles about like how important it is to take great photos of the dogs, right? So, I mean, if you are a photographer, if you are like really good at social media, like there are opportunities to help spread the word about these dogs too.
Yes, that's a great idea. There's nothing cuter than a goat in a flower crown, or a dog, or a dog in a cute little sweater. And it really does a lot for them. I think the animals actually, they enjoy that interaction, and they really shine through in those photos. And I think that helps the animals, but it certainly helps the general community see them in a different light and see that happier side of them.
We all want to be supermodels,
Exactly.
So I have two other questions, I think, and then we'll wrap it up. Another shift here, but I would be really interested in your thoughts about this. Shelley asks if you think there's any possibility in the future for some kind of a national database that tracks animal abuse cases, to help make sure that there aren't repeat offenders.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we do our best to track that. We certainly deal with a large number of animal abuse cases, and we do keep track of those individuals who have a history of animal abuse. We keep medical records. The courts keep copies of those cases. And I definitely think a national database is something that, that should be in the future. I'm not sure if they're working on something like that, or the extent of how that exists, but we certainly keep track of it in terms of locally cases and individuals that we see. We know very well the areas of Houston and the surrounding cities and counties that we work with, where the animal abuse has occurred, or where we have found cases of animal abuse, and we keep very detailed track of that. So yes, a national database would be wonderful.
How are you circled in animal abuse cases?
Well, we have a cruelty and investigations team, And that team investigates reports of animal cruelty. They intake phone calls. These phone calls could be from a concerned neighbor. They could be from someone who is passing by and seeing an animal on the side of the road being abused. And they can phone in to the Houston SPCA and make contact with our investigations department. And then our investigators go out and investigate the case. What happens is when we get a warrant, because there does need to be a warrant to bring the animal in, once the animal is brought to the Houston SPCA, our veterinary staff, myself and the other veterinarians, perform a very thorough, full physical exam on the animal so that we can determine if there's any evidence of external abuse or disease. Because one thing that people may not realize is, even if you have a pet or someone has a pet that has a serious disease and that disease is neglected and they don't do anything about the disease such that the animal is suffering, then those things can be deemed animal abuse as well. So we do thorough exams to identify diseases that have not been addressed or physical abuse that's present. We write medical notes, and those notes become evidence, become court evidence. And we have to go to court and we have to go in front of a judge and discuss our findings for that animal. And if we know the owner of the owner of the animal comes to court, and they can also give their testimony and plead their case. And the judge makes a determination about whether or not animal cruelty was in fact found in this case. And then the judge will award the animal either to the humane organization or back to the original owner based on the case. So we are involved in that actually on a daily basis. And unfortunately, we do see more animal abuse than we want to. And it's on a daily basis, unfortunately.
But this is another way that you're a community resource, right? That that shelters are working to keep communities of animals and people safe all around.
Absolutely, because there is certainly a link, and that's a whole nother discussion, but there's definitely a link between animal abuse and human abuse. And so when it's very important as a community resource and community link to identify those who have a history of animal abuse, because we may be able to save human lives by doing that.
I want to comment on that from the perspective of the person who had asked this question. The nature of these kinds of relationships that include investigations into animal cruelty and animal abuse will vary a little bit based on where you are, whether you're in a big municipal area or a smaller rural area. And you can certainly investigate who your local appropriate authority is to report to. But I think that one of the things that is changing on the legal landscape nationally is because of what Dr. Dev mentioned, the very well described and well-known link between animal abuse and domestic violence. Increasingly, reports of animal abuse in some states are required to be made because of the concern that the person who abused the animal might also be guilty of other crimes. And so there are some states where animal abuse is required to be reported by veterinarians when they discover it in the course of their normal work. They're mandated to report it in the same way that in many states, it's mandated to report child abuse, for instance, because of the likelihood that there's an ongoing additional crime. And so I think that the landscape is shifting towards recognizing how fundamental that problem is and how it is related to other concerns, and requiring more transparency and more reporting by veterinarians and other professionals who might encounter it in the course of their daily work.
It's probably worth mentioning also that that is part of the Dog Aging Project policy, that if we learn in any way that an animal is being abused, that is something that we are mandatory reporters for.
Would report.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for talking about that. I think to close us out, I would love to know if you have advice or encouragement for folks who think, I need a new member of my family and I should go to my neighborhood shelter and get one. So maybe just a plug for that from both of you.
Absolutely. I would say, number one, know your family, know yourself, know your family, and talk to each other and determine what kind of pet you're looking for. High energy, couch potato, small, large, because again, it's about making that perfect match. So, study what you and your family, what the idea is that you have for a new pet and how much time you can commit to this new pet. As Dr. Creevy mentioned earlier, Can you dedicate the time to a puppy, or do you need an adult dog where you kind of already know their behavior? Maybe they're already potty trained. And so one, it starts with knowing what you want. The second part is be patient. I can't say it enough. Be patient. When you bring that new animal home to you, that new animal, as that new pet, as we mentioned, we don't know their background. And so they need time to adjust to this new home. And they're going to need, we say usually 3 days to just decompress when they come to your home. Give them 3 days just to try to learn where they are, you know, the new people that are around, the new sights, the new sounds. Then give them 3 weeks to learn your routines, proper behavior around the house, and how to integrate themselves into your family. And then give them 3 months to really come out of their shell and be themselves. And that takes time, that takes patience. And we encourage all adopters to give them that time to determine how they're going to be and how well they're going to fit into the family. So I'll always consider your local shelter if you're looking for a new pet. It's no harm in coming to look and to visit with the animals at least.
I absolutely agree that you should definitely reach out to your local shelter if you're considering getting a pet. And I want to put in another plug for those adult dogs in shelters. Adult dogs in shelters have a lot to offer as far as stability of temperament and stability of body size. And as Dr. Dev mentioned, they might either be housebroken or be much easier to housebreak because they are adults and they can understand those sorts of things. And so I really want to encourage people not to be unwilling to adopt an adult dog. Of course, puppies are fun, puppies are great, but adult dogs have special charms as well.
Yes.
Thank you both so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yes, thanks. Great.
Thank you. For those of you out there, a couple other things to share with you. So just before we wrap up, I have a couple of other things I wanted to share with you. Let me see if we can do, slide sharing. I want to show you a couple slides. Oh, technology. So just another shout out to Dr. Dev and the Houston SPCA. It's an amazing organization that does so much work in the community, as you've heard from this discussion. And if you're in the area, obviously you can volunteer, donate, be part of that change. That would be amazing. I also wanted to just introduce you briefly to the other members of our Animal Welfare Advisory Board at the Dog Aging Project. We have a really powerhouse team, and we're so grateful to all of these amazing veterinarians for being part of this project. And finally, I wanted to show you a little bit of data, since the Dog Aging Project is all about data. As you may have heard, we've done some more marketing and some media around areas with our participating veterinary teaching hospitals. So you may have seen some more about the Dog Aging Project in the news. And many of you have, shared and supported these efforts. We're really grateful. And this crazy iceberg looking graph is just showing the number of people on any given day who've nominated their dog for the Dog Aging Project. So you see we have that big spike from last week, and that is just great news for us. So more dogs in the project means more data, more ability for us and our project to really answer the questions about healthy aging in dogs that we are all really curious about and committed to investigating. So thank you for your help. And finally, I just want to close with a little video that introduces you to a rescue dog who is a very, very special member of this project.
My two dogs, Poet and Chato, are important members of my family. Poet is a Border Collie, and she is a Dog Aging Project PAC member. And Chato is a Pit Bull mix, and he is my old man. He had a rough start to life because as a young dog, he was maliciously burned. His owner knew that he couldn't provide him the care that he needed and sought help from the Atlanta Humane Society, who arranged to provide for all of Chato's medical and surgical care. After that, his owner was reluctant to take him back to the neighborhood where the injury had occurred.
and Chacho got to come and live with me. He's my buddy, and he's my terrific old man. The Dog Aging Project is interested in dogs from all sorts of backgrounds. Rescue dogs in particular can provide us the variety we need in breed background, size, age, and life history.